Jasmine Powell's hand trembled as she placed her federal auditor badge on the airline counter. The white flight attendant who had just humiliated her in front of everyone turned ghostly pale. "I wasn't planning an investigation today," Jasmine whispered, "but plans change. Before we dive into this shocking story, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. If you believe everyone deserves equal treatment regardless of skin color, hit that like button and subscribe to see more stories of justice being served. Now, let's see how Jasmine went from being humiliated to turning the tables. Jasmine Powell stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror of her Detroit apartment. At 38 years old, the lines around her eyes told stories of 15 years as a Federal Aviation Administration auditor. Today would be different from any other assignment. She carefully applied her makeup, deliberately choosing a more casual style than her usual professional look. "Just another passenger," she whispered to herself. "Just another black woman trying to fly." 3 weeks earlier, her director had called her into his office with a special assignment. The FAA had received multiple discrimination complaints against several major airlines. As one of their most experienced auditors and the only black woman in the senior team, Jasmine was the perfect choice to conduct a series of undercover investigations. "You'll be flying first class on taxpayer money," Director Wilson had said with a half-smile. "But don't get too comfortable. We need concrete evidence if we're going to make these airlines change their policies." Growing up in Detroit's East Side, Jasmine had learned early about standing tall despite racism. Her father, a high school history teacher, and her mother, a nurse, had instilled in her an unshakable dignity. "They might judge your skin," her father would say, "but they can't judge your mind unless you let them." Those lessons had carried her through college at Howard University, through her master's degree in public administration, and through 15 years of building a reputation as one of the FAA's most thorough and fair-minded auditors. Now, Jasmine methodically packed her carry-on bag. Inside were her regular clothes, toiletries, and, hidden in specially designed compartments, high-quality recording devices, a small camera disguised as a pen, and her federal credentials. She had spent the previous day reviewing all relevant regulations, airline policies, and discrimination laws that would be pertinent to her investigation. The promotion to lead investigator 6 months ago hadn't come easily. Harold Thompson, who had been with the agency 3 years less than Jasmine, had filed a complaint when she got the position instead of him. "I'm just saying qualifications should matter more than quotas," he'd said within earshot of her desk. The complaint went nowhere, but the whispers remained. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas, her mentor since she'd joined the agency. Now retired, he still checked in before her big assignments. "Remember, this airline has had 17 complaints in the past year alone," his message read. 6 specifically about first-class seating disputes. "Stay safe and stay sharp." Jasmine texted back a quick thanks, then double-checked her equipment. The recording devices were state-of-the-art, designed to capture audio clearly even in the noisy environment of an airport and airplane. The camera pen would document visual evidence of any discriminatory treatment. This wasn't just another assignment. 3 years ago, flying this same airline, a flight attendant had accused her of trying to sneak into first class when she was simply walking to the bathroom. The humiliation had burned, but she'd had no proof, no recourse. Now she had both the authority and the tools to ensure accountability. As she zipped up her suitcase, Jasmine recalled Director Wilson's final words about the assignment: "We're not looking to play gotcha here. In an ideal world, you'll find nothing to report. But if there are violations, we need to know." In the ride-share to the airport, Jasmine mentally rehearsed her role. Today, she wasn't lead investigator Powell with 15 years of federal service. Today, she was just Jasmine, a woman taking a flight from Detroit to Atlanta. Her casual jeans, simple blouse, and minimal jewelry gave no hint of her professional status or income level. Nothing about her appearance suggested she belonged in first class, except for the legitimate ticket the FAA had purchased. As the Detroit Metropolitan Airport came into view, Jasmine took a deep breath. Just another day, she told herself. But they both knew it wasn't true. The morning bustle of Detroit Metropolitan Airport enveloped Jasmine as she entered the terminal. She deliberately arrived 2 hours early, giving herself ample time to observe and document the treatment of passengers from different backgrounds. At the security checkpoint, Jasmine noted the first discrepancy. The TSA agent waved through a white businessman with a cursory glance at his ID, but when Jasmine presented her documents, the agent scrutinized her driver's license, holding it up to the light and comparing her face to the photo multiple times. "Is there a problem?" Jasmine asked politely. "Just doing my job, ma'am," the agent replied without making eye contact. "Step through the scanner, please." After clearing security, Jasmine headed toward the premium lounge area. The airline's loyalty program entitled first-class passengers to use the lounge before boarding. As she approached the entrance, a well-dressed white man in his 50s fell into step beside her. "First time in Detroit?" he asked with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "No," Jasmine replied. "I'm actually from here." "Oh." The man, who introduced himself as Garrett Wilson, seemed genuinely surprised. "Business or pleasure today?" "Just visiting family in Atlanta," Jasmine said, sticking to her cover story. Garrett nodded. "I'm heading to a technology conference myself. Corner suite at the Ritz-Carlton. The company takes care of its executives, you know." Jasmine noticed how he emphasized his accommodations, as if to justify his presence in the premium section of the airport. She also noticed how he didn't ask what she did for a living or why she was in the lounge area. At the lounge entrance, the attendant greeted Garrett warmly. "Welcome back, Mr. Wilson. Your usual seat by the window is available." When Jasmine stepped up next, the same attendant's smile faded slightly. "Membership card and boarding pass, please." After examining Jasmine's documents for nearly 30 seconds, far longer than she had looked at Garrett's, the attendant reluctantly stepped aside. "Enjoy your wait, Ms. Powell." Inside the lounge, Jasmine observed similar patterns. White passengers were offered drinks promptly, while the few people of color had to approach the bar themselves. She made mental notes of everything, occasionally speaking quietly into her phone as if sending voice texts, but actually recording her observations. 45 minutes before boarding, Jasmine headed to the gate. There, she noticed an airline employee named Brittany Stevens, according to her name tag, managing the desk. Brittany's demeanor shifted visibly depending on who approached her. To older white passengers, she was solicitous and patient. To a Hispanic family with questions about their seating, she was curt and dismissive. Taking a seat near the desk, Jasmine pretended to read a magazine while listening to Brittany's conversation with her colleague, a young man whose name tag read, Kevin Richards. "They're at it again," Brittany muttered to Kevin when a black businessman approached to ask about an upgrade. "These people always trying to use points for upgrades at the last minute. As if first class isn't expensive enough already," Kevin replied with a smirk. The businessman, evidently a frequent flyer with elite status, eventually received his upgrade, but not before Brittany made him verify his points balance multiple times and check with Kevin about availability, steps Jasmine hadn't seen her take with white passengers requesting similar changes. As Jasmine observed, her professional detachment battled with personal indignation. This wasn't just about doing her job anymore. Each dismissive glance, each subtle slight, these people comments stoked memories of her own experiences, not just as a passenger, but throughout her life. She remembered standing in this very airport 5 years ago, being pulled aside for a random security check while white passengers streamed past. That incident had fueled her decision to apply for the FAA's Civil Rights Compliance Division rather than remaining in technical inspections. Looking around the gate area, Jasmine noticed other black passengers. There was a silent communication between them, a knowing glance here, a slight head shake there. It was a language developed over generations, a shared understanding of what it meant to navigate spaces where your presence was constantly questioned. As boarding time approached, Jasmine discreetly activated her recording devices. The pen camera was clipped to her blouse, angled perfectly to capture interactions at face level. The audio recorder was tucked into her jacket pocket, sensitive enough to pick up conversations several feet away. The gate agent announced pre-boarding for passengers needing assistance, followed by first class. Jasmine gathered her belongings, ticket in hand, and prepared to board. Whatever happened next would be captured in high-definition detail for the federal government to review. Now boarding our first-class passengers for Flight 1827 to Atlanta, Brittany Stevens announced over the intercom. First-class passengers only at this time, please. Jasmine stood, gathered her carry-on bag, and joined the short line forming at the priority boarding lane. Ahead of her were 3 passengers, an older white couple and a middle-aged white man in a business suit. Behind her, 2 more passengers queued up, both white, both dressed in business casual attire. As the line moved forward, Jasmine observed Brittany's interactions with each passenger. Smiles, pleasant greetings, quick scans of boarding passes, and swift gestures toward the jet bridge. The process took mere seconds for each person. Then it was Jasmine's turn. "Boarding pass and ID, please," Brittany said, her smile noticeably less warm than it had been for previous passengers. Jasmine handed over her documents. Brittany's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly as she looked from the first-class boarding pass to Jasmine and back again. "Is there a problem?" Jasmine asked. "You're in, first class." The question hung in the air, laden with skepticism. "Yes, I am," Jasmine replied evenly. Brittany studied the boarding pass more carefully, then examined Jasmine's ID with unusual scrutiny. "One moment, please." She turned to her colleague Kevin, who had been checking in standby passengers at the adjacent computer. "Can you verify this, please?" Brittany's voice carried just enough for passengers nearby to hear. "Watching your first-class ticket get questioned when others sail through, have you ever experienced something similar? Comment 1 if you've faced this kind of scrutiny that others seem to avoid. Like and subscribe if you believe accountability matters in these situations. Now, what do you think will happen when Kevin gets involved? Will he recognize the injustice or double down on the discrimination?" Kevin came over, taking both Jasmine's boarding pass and ID. He looked at them, then at Jasmine, making no effort to hide his surprise. "How did you get this seat?" he asked bluntly. The question hung in the air like a slap. Behind Jasmine, the line of passengers waiting to board had grown. People were watching now, witnessing her being held up while others had been processed quickly. "I purchased it, just like everyone else," Jasmine replied, keeping her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. "These are very expensive seats," Brittany interjected, as if explaining something to a child. "Are you sure you didn't mistake economy comfort for first class?" "I'm quite certain I know what ticket I purchased," Jasmine said. She could feel her heart rate increasing but maintained her composure. "My boarding pass clearly says first class, seat 3A. Kevin and Brittany exchanged glances. Kevin handed the documents back to Brittany rather than to Jasmine. "What's the hold-up here?" asked another airline employee who approached the desk. His name tag identified him as Michael Thompson, gate supervisor. "This passenger claims to have a first-class ticket," Brittany explained, emphasizing the word "claims" in a way that suggested fraud. Michael glanced at Jasmine, then at her documents. "How did you purchase this ticket, ma'am?" "Online, through the airline's website," Jasmine answered truthfully, omitting that the federal government had paid for it. "Using whose credit card?" Michael pressed. "Mine," Jasmine replied, her indignation growing. "Is there typically an interrogation for first-class passengers, or am I receiving special treatment today?" By now, the white passengers behind Jasmine were being directed to a second line to board, bypassing the holdup. They glanced curiously at the scene as they passed. "We've had issues with fraudulent upgrades recently," Michael explained without apologizing. "We're just being thorough." "Fraudulent upgrades from whom, exactly?" Jasmine asked, knowing full well what they were implying but wanting to see if they would say it explicitly. Michael ignored the question. Brittany, verify the payment method in the system. While Brittany clicked through screens, Jasmine became acutely aware of the spectacle they were creating. Several passengers had stopped to watch. Some had phones out, possibly recording. The humiliation burned, even as the investigator part of her mind registered that this was exactly the evidence she needed. The payment went through, Brittany finally admitted, sounding almost disappointed. But there's still the matter of our dress code policy for first class. Your dress code policy? Jasmine repeated incredulously. Please, show me where that's documented. Michael stepped closer, lowering his voice. Ma'am, if you continue to be disruptive, we'll need to call security. Disruptive? Jasmine looked around at the scene they, not she, had created. I simply presented my valid boarding pass, the same as every other passenger. Sir, a voice called from the line. An older black man named Walter Johnson stepped forward. I've been watching this whole interaction. This lady hasn't done anything wrong. You're holding her up when everyone else went straight through. Sir, please return to your place in line, Michael said sharply. This doesn't concern you. It concerns all of us when we see unfair treatment, Walter insisted. Michael's face hardened. He reached for the desk phone. Security to gate 42, please. Disruptive passengers. Jasmine stood in shocked silence. This had escalated far beyond what she had anticipated, and now another passenger was being dragged into it simply for speaking up on her behalf. I'm not being disruptive, Jasmine stated clearly, aware that her recording devices were capturing everything. I presented valid documents for boarding, which you've now verified are legitimate. I'm simply requesting to board my flight. You'll board when we say you can board, Brittany snapped, dropping all pretense of customer service. Meanwhile, the last of the white first-class passengers were escorted around the confrontation and onto the plane. Jasmine watched them go, their journey uninterrupted by suspicion or scrutiny. Two security officers approached the gate with purposeful strides, hands positioned near their weapons. The taller officer, a white man with close-cropped hair, assessed the situation with cold eyes. His name tag read, Officer Davidson. The second officer, a Latino man whose tag identified him as Officer Gregory Wallace, looked more uncertain. What seems to be the problem here? Officer Davidson asked Michael, completely ignoring Jasmine. We have two disruptive passengers, Michael replied, gesturing to Jasmine and Walter, who still stood nearby. They're interfering with the boarding process and becoming confrontational. Jasmine felt a chill run through her body. In her years of government service, she'd learned how situations involving security could escalate dangerously, especially for people of color. Despite knowing she had done nothing wrong. Despite being a federal employee herself, fear crept up her spine. I have not been disruptive, Jasmine stated clearly, addressing the officers directly. I presented my valid first-class boarding pass and was subjected to questioning that no other passenger received. Officer Wallace turned to her. Ma'am, how did you obtain this ticket? The question stung. Even from security personnel, the assumption was that she couldn't legitimately possess a first-class ticket. I purchased it online, using my own credit card, which the airline staff has already verified, Jasmine explained, fighting to keep her voice steady. Around them, a small crowd had gathered. Some passengers openly recorded the confrontation on their phones. Others looked away uncomfortably, pretending not to notice. The public nature of the humiliation made it all the worse. Jasmine suddenly thought of her brother Dwayne. 10 years ago, he'd been detained at a high-end electronics store after purchasing an expensive camera. Security had been called because someone thought he didn't look like he could afford it. The public humiliation had affected him deeply. He'd never returned to that store chain and became anxious in similar shopping environments for years afterward. Now Jasmine understood his trauma on a visceral level. Her credentials, her education, her federal position, none of it mattered in this moment. To these people, she was just another black person who didn't belong in first class. She was argumentative when questioned about her ticket, Brittany interjected. And then this gentleman, she pointed to Walter, interfered with airline staff performing their duties. I simply asked why she was being treated differently than the white passengers, Walter said calmly. That's not interference, that's a legitimate question. Officer Davidson stepped closer to Jasmine, invading her personal space. Ma'am, I need you to step aside from the boarding area. May I ask why? Jasmine said, standing her ground. My flight is boarding now, and my ticket has been verified as legitimate. We need to investigate the situation, Officer Davidson replied. How did you pay for this ticket? Where did you get the money for a first-class seat? The questions were so blatantly discriminatory that gasps came from several onlookers. A white woman in line covered her mouth in shock. A young Asian man shook his head in disbelief. Walter, despite the risk to himself, spoke up again. Would you ask a white passenger those questions? This is textbook discrimination. Sir, one more word and you'll be detained, Officer Davidson warned. Jasmine felt a moment of panic for Walter. This man, a stranger who had simply stood up for what was right, was now in danger of being detained. She couldn't let that happen. It's all right, she told Walter quietly. Thank you for your support, but please don't put yourself at risk. Walter reluctantly stepped back, but his eyes conveyed a message of solidarity. Officer Wallace, seemingly uncomfortable with his colleague's approach, attempted a more reasonable tone. Ma'am, perhaps we can verify your information quickly and get this sorted out. Meanwhile, the boarding process continued around them. More white passengers streamed past, casting curious glances at the confrontation. Some first-class seats were now being filled by white passengers who had received last-minute upgrades, passengers who had faced none of the scrutiny Jasmine endured. The injustice of it burned in Jasmine's chest. She had two choices. Reveal her identity as a federal auditor and end this immediately, or continue to experience what countless other black travelers faced daily. From an investigative standpoint, maintaining her cover would yield the most comprehensive evidence. But the personal cost was mounting by the second. Jasmine's phone buzzed in her pocket, likely a text from her supervisor Cameron checking on her progress. She couldn't check it now, not with security officers looming over her. An elderly black woman named Elaine, who had been watching from a nearby seat, slowly approached. Excuse me, she said to no one in particular, her voice gentle but firm. I've been flying for 60 years, and I've seen this story before. This young lady has done nothing wrong except fly while black. The simple truth of Elaine's statement hung in the air. Officer Wallace looked increasingly uncomfortable. Some passengers nodded in agreement. Brittany, however, doubled down. This has nothing to do with race. We have security protocols that apparently only apply to certain passengers, Jasmine finished for her. She took a deep breath, weighing her options one final time. In that moment, Jasmine remembered a pivotal decision in her career 5 years ago. She had been offered a prestigious position at a private aviation consulting firm, better pay, better hours, less bureaucracy. But she had chosen to stay with the FAA specifically because she believed in changing the system from within. You can't fix what you flee from, her father had always said. That conviction steadied her now. The humiliation was acute, but the potential impact of her complete audit could help thousands of travelers who faced similar discrimination without her power or resources. I'll step aside, Jasmine finally said to Officer Wallace, but I want it noted that I've complied fully while being singled out and publicly humiliated. As she moved away from the boarding area, Jasmine heard Brittany mutter to Michael, these people always cause trouble. Always making everything about race. The irony was painful. By attempting to exercise the same rights as white passengers, the right to board with a valid ticket without harassment, she was labeled as causing trouble. After several more minutes of questioning, during which the boarding process was nearly completed, Jasmine was finally allowed to board the plane. But rather than being escorted to her first-class seat, she was directed to an economy seat near the back. "There must be some mistake," Jasmine said to the flight attendant, a woman named Diana with a tight smile. "My ticket is for first class, seat 3A. Diana barely glanced at Jasmine's boarding pass. "The gate agents made a note that you've been reassigned due to a technical issue. You can discuss compensation after we land." Jasmine understood what had happened. This was retaliation for questioning their authority, a final humiliation designed to put her in her place. As she reluctantly took the economy seat, she discreetly ensured her recording devices were still functioning. She might be sitting in economy, but she was documenting first-class evidence of discrimination. Jasmine sat rigidly in the cramped economy seat, her mind racing between professional calculation and personal anguish. The weight of the humiliation pressed on her chest, making it difficult to breathe normally. Around her, passengers settled in, some casting curious glances her way. They had witnessed the confrontation at the gate and now saw her seated far from the first-class cabin she had fought to access. Her phone vibrated again. Discreetly, she checked the screen to see a message from her supervisor, Cameron Wright, checking in. "How's the audit progressing?" What could she possibly say? That she'd been publicly humiliated, racially profiled, and denied the seat the government had purchased for her. That security had been called because she dared to question discriminatory treatment. Before she could formulate a response, an elderly black woman slid into the seat beside her. It was Elaine, the woman who had spoken up at the gate. "You held yourself with such dignity out there," Elaine said quietly. "Reminded me of how we had to behave during the sit-ins in the 60s. Calm on the outside, fire on the inside." Jasmine managed a small smile. "Thank you for speaking up. Not many would have. I've seen too much in my 82 years to stay silent," Elaine replied. "My silence won't protect me," as Audre Lorde said. "Nor will it protect you or the next person they decide doesn't belong." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the head flight attendant performing final checks before takeoff. When she reached Jasmine's row, her eyes widened slightly in recognition. She had clearly been briefed about the problem passenger. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Jasmine's mind drifted back to a decisive moment in her career. 3 years ago, she had been leading an investigation into safety violations at a regional airport. The airport director, a well-connected political appointee, had tried to bribe her to overlook certain findings. When that failed, he threatened her career. Jasmine had walked away from the meeting and immediately reported the interaction to her superiors and the FBI. The director had been removed, the safety issues addressed, and Jasmine had received a commendation for her integrity. That day, she had reaffirmed her commitment to fighting corruption and injustice from within the system. Today presented a similar decision point, but with much more personal stakes. Revealing her identity would immediately end her humiliation. The airline staff would likely fall over themselves apologizing. But it would also end the audit prematurely. No one would behave naturally once they knew a federal auditor was on board, and the opportunity to document the full extent of discriminatory practices would be lost. Beside her, Elaine seemed to sense her internal struggle. "Whatever you're deciding," the older woman said softly, "remember that sometimes our dignity is worth more than our strategy." Jasmine nodded, genuinely appreciating the wisdom. But in this case, her strategy was about more than personal vindication. It was about gathering evidence that could force institutional change and protect the dignity of countless future travelers. Her decision crystallized: she would maintain her cover despite the personal cost. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Jasmine observed the flight attendant's interactions with passengers. Diana, who had dismissed Jasmine's seating concerns earlier, was now all smiles serving drinks in first class. Through the parted curtain, Jasmine could see Brittany had boarded the flight as well, working in the first-class cabin. From her economy seat, Jasmine heard snippets of their conversation during a quiet moment. Can you believe she tried to claim discrimination? Brittany whispered to Diana. Always playing the race card when they don't get special treatment. They're all the same, Diana replied with a knowing nod. Always causing trouble, making everything harder for everyone. Jasmine felt her hands trembling with suppressed anger. She discreetly adjusted her recording devices, ensuring they captured these damning exchanges. A different flight attendant named James came through the economy section with the beverage cart. Unlike his colleagues, he offered Jasmine a genuine smile and a full can of soda rather than the small cup given to other economy passengers. "I saw what happened at the gate," he said quietly while arranging her drink and napkin. "It wasn't right. I'm sorry." The small gesture of humanity was almost enough to break Jasmine's carefully maintained composure. "Thank you," she managed to say. As the flight continued, Jasmine documented multiple instances of differential treatment. Black passengers' requests for pillows or assistance with luggage were met with delays or excuses, while white passengers received prompt service. A Hispanic family was chastised loudly for having a fussy baby, while a white couple with an equally vocal toddler received sympathetic smiles and offers of assistance. Halfway through the flight, an incident unfolded that cemented Jasmine's resolve. A young black businessman named Devin was accused by Diana of inappropriate behavior after he asked for a second beverage. The accusation was loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, causing visible embarrassment for Devin and uncomfortable glances from others. "I just asked for another ginger ale," Devin protested. "How is that inappropriate?" "It was your tone and attitude," Diana insisted, though Jasmine had observed the exchange and noted Devin's perfectly polite demeanor. Jasmine discreetly added another note to her growing documentation of federal violations. The pattern was unmistakable, the evidence mounting with each passing hour. A teenage girl named Sarah, seated across the aisle, leaned over to Jasmine. "I recorded what happened to you at the gate," she whispered. "My social studies class is doing a project on civil rights. Would it be okay if I used the video?" The question highlighted the public nature of Jasmine's humiliation, but also suggested that some good might come from it beyond her official audit. "That would be fine," Jasmine replied. "It's important for people to see these things still happen." As the plane began its descent into Atlanta, Jasmine faced her final decision point of the flight, whether to reveal her identity upon landing or continue gathering evidence through the deplaning process and at the destination airport. The recording devices had captured hours of damning evidence. She had meticulous notes on multiple violations of federal transportation discrimination laws. A revelation now would still make an impact. But the investigator in her wanted the complete picture. How would staff behave during deplaning? Would the discriminatory patterns continue at the arrival gate? Would there be any acknowledgement or attempt to address the seat reassignment? Watching Brittany and Diana laugh together in the first-class cabin, Jasmine made her decision. She would see this through to the end, document everything, and ensure that the consequences were proportional to the full scope of violations, not just those directed at her personally. As the plane touched down in Atlanta, Jasmine straightened in her seat, her resolve hardened by hours of witnessed injustice. The personal humiliation still stung, but it had been transformed into professional purpose. The airline had no idea who they had messed with, and soon they would learn the consequences of their actions in the most official way possible. The seatbelt sign dinged off as the plane reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Jasmine remained in her economy seat, acutely aware of the stares from nearby passengers. The confrontation at the gate had created a spectacle, and now she was an object of curiosity, or worse, pity. A middle-aged white woman across the aisle leaned over. "I saw what happened back there," she whispered. "Just awful how they treated you." Jasmine nodded politely but didn't engage further. She couldn't afford to be distracted from her documentation. Every interaction, every comment, every disparity in service needed to be recorded for her report. In the first-class cabin, visible through the parted curtain, Brittany moved between seats offering hot towels and taking drink orders. The passengers, all white except for one Asian man, received warm smiles and attentive service. Meanwhile, in economy, Diana and another flight attendant named Rachel pushed the beverage cart down the aisle. Jasmine noticed immediately how their demeanor changed depending on who they were serving. White passengers received eye contact and friendly banter. Black and brown passengers got minimal interaction and sometimes had to repeat their drink requests. When they reached Jasmine's row, Diana's smile tightened visibly. "Beverage?" she asked curtly. "Water, please," Jasmine replied. Diana thrust a plastic cup at her without a word and moved on, not waiting to see if Jasmine wanted ice or a full can like she had offered to white passengers. Have you ever noticed different treatment from service staff based on your appearance? Comment 1 if you've experienced or witnessed this kind of subtle discrimination. Like and subscribe if you believe everyone deserves equal respect regardless of their skin color. Now, what do you think will happen when the flight attendants realize other passengers are watching how they treat Jasmine? Will they adjust their behavior or continue the pattern? A few rows ahead, Jasmine observed a young black couple with a sleeping infant receiving terse instructions about keeping their child quiet, though the baby wasn't making any noise. 20 minutes later, a white family with a crying toddler was offered assistance and sympathetic smiles from the same flight attendants. "Unbelievable," muttered Elaine beside her. "Some things never change, they just get more subtle." About an hour into the flight, James, the third flight attendant, came through with a second beverage service. Unlike his colleagues, he maintained a consistent demeanor with all passengers. When he reached Jasmine, he offered a small but genuine smile. "Would you like anything to drink?" he asked, making eye contact. "Just water again, thank you," Jasmine replied. James handed her not just a cup but a whole bottle of water. "It's a dry flight," he said, loud enough for others to hear. Then, lowering his voice, he added, "I saw what happened at the gate. Not everyone here feels the same way as those two." The small gesture of humanity touched Jasmine. "Thank you," she said quietly. As James moved on, Jasmine discreetly adjusted her recording devices. The pen camera clipped to her blouse had been capturing interactions throughout the flight, and the audio recorder in her pocket was picking up conversations clearly despite the ambient noise of the plane. Midway through the flight, Jasmine observed an incident that perfectly exemplified the pattern of discrimination. A black passenger named Terrence politely asked Diana for a second glass of wine, which was standard service even in economy. "We're limiting alcoholic beverages on this flight," Diana told him curtly. "One per passenger." 10 minutes later, Jasmine watched as the same flight attendant cheerfully provided a third glass of wine to a white businessman without comment. "Did you see that?" whispered a teenage girl seated across the aisle from Jasmine. She had introduced herself earlier as Sarah, a high school student traveling to visit her grandmother. "I did," Jasmine confirmed. "I've been recording stuff like that on my phone," Sarah admitted. "My social studies class is doing a project on everyday discrimination. Would it be okay if I interviewed you about what happened at the gate?" The request surprised Jasmine. This young white girl was not only noticing the injustice but documenting it for educational purposes. "That's an important project," Jasmine said carefully. "I'd be happy to share my perspective after the flight." As they spoke, Jasmine noticed Brittany emerging from the first-class cabin and conferring with Diana near the galley. Both women glanced in her direction multiple times, their expressions disapproving. "They keep looking at you like you're trouble," Sarah observed. "All because you wanted the seat you paid for." "It's a familiar experience for many of us," Jasmine replied. The conversation was interrupted when Terrence, the passenger who had been denied a second wine, stood up to use the lavatory. As he waited in the aisle, Diana approached him. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat," she said loudly. "You're blocking the aisle." "I'm just waiting for the bathroom," Terrence explained, pointing to the occupied lavatory sign. "You need to sit down until the lavatory is available," Diana insisted, though Jasmine had observed multiple white passengers standing in the exact same spot earlier without comment. Terence, clearly recognizing the futility of arguing, returned to his seat. The humiliation on his face was painfully familiar to Jasmine. "That's going in my project too," Sarah said, discreetly typing notes on her phone. The pattern continued throughout the flight. Black passengers' call buttons were answered slowly or ignored. Their requests were treated as impositions. Their complaints were dismissed. All while white passengers received prompt, courteous service. Jasmine documented each incident methodically, building a comprehensive picture of systemic discrimination that went far beyond her personal experience at the gate. During a quiet moment when most passengers were watching movies or napping, Jasmine overheard a conversation between Brittany and Diana in the galley. "Did you see that guy in 22C trying to get free drinks?" Brittany whispered. "They always want something for nothing." "Always," Diana agreed. "And they're the first to cry discrimination when you call them on it. Remember that lawsuit last year?" Brittany continued. "That woman claimed we discriminated against her, but she was being completely unreasonable about the overhead bin space. The company settled just to make it go away," Diana said bitterly. "Teaches them they can get paid just by playing the race card." Jasmine felt a surge of anger but channeled it into careful documentation. These conversations provided crucial context for the discriminatory behaviors she was observing. Evidence that the problem was cultural and systemic, not isolated to a few individuals. As the flight progressed, Jasmine continued gathering evidence while reflecting on the thousands of black travelers who endured similar treatment without her power to document and address it. Many simply accepted the indignities as part of travel, an added tax on moving through the world while black. Others who spoke up were labeled as troublemakers or worse, sometimes facing escalation like Jasmine had experienced at the gate. The weight of responsibility settled on Jasmine's shoulders. Her audit had become about much more than compliance with federal regulations. It was about basic human dignity and the right to equal treatment in public accommodations, rights that had supposedly been secured decades ago but remained elusive in practice. 2 hours into the flight, the captain announced they were beginning their descent into Atlanta. Jasmine prepared herself for the final phase of her investigation. How would the crew handle deplaning? Would the discriminatory patterns continue at the arrival gate? As passengers gathered their belongings, Jasmine noticed Brittany and Diana having one final conversation near the front of the plane. Though she couldn't hear their words, their glances in her direction spoke volumes. "You've been taking notes this whole flight," observed Elaine beside her. "Are you a journalist?" "Something like that," Jasmine replied with a small smile. The plane touched down at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, rolling to a stop at the gate after a brief taxi. As the seatbelt sign turned off, Diana's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Atlanta. Local time is 2:15 p.m. with clear skies and a temperature of 82 degrees. Please remain seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop at the gate." The standard announcement continued, concluding with, "For our first-class passengers, you may deplane at your convenience. All other passengers, please remain seated until all first-class passengers have exited." Jasmine watched as the first-class passengers gathered their belongings and filed off the plane. Brittany stood at the door, offering warm farewells to each one. "Thank you for flying with us, Mr. Johnson. Have a wonderful day, Mrs. Smith. We hope to see you again soon, Dr. Williams." When the economy passengers were finally permitted to deplane, the contrast was stark. Brittany's warm smile had cooled considerably. She offered no personalized farewells to the economy passengers, merely a rehearsed, "thank you," repeated mechanically. When black passengers passed, Jasmine noticed Brittany didn't make eye contact at all. As Jasmine approached the exit, Brittany's expression hardened into something approaching a smirk. "Thank you," she said flatly, her eyes already moving to the passenger behind Jasmine. That small, final indignity crystallized Jasmine's resolve. The time for anonymity was over. The airline staff had provided more than enough evidence of discriminatory treatment. Now they would learn the consequences of their actions. Jasmine stepped into the jet bridge, her mind made up. The systematic discrimination she had witnessed went far beyond her personal experience, it was endemic and deliberate. The evidence she had gathered would speak for itself, but first, there was the matter of accountability for those directly involved in her mistreatment. She paused at the gate, waiting for Brittany to emerge from the aircraft. The flight attendant appeared a few minutes later, chatting animatedly with Diana and Michael, who had apparently flown with the crew. Their conversation halted abruptly when they spotted Jasmine. "Excuse me," Jasmine called, approaching the group. "I'd like to speak with the head flight attendant and a supervisor about what occurred today." Brittany's expression shifted from surprise to annoyance. "If you have a complaint, you can file it online like everyone else." "I'd prefer to address it now," Jasmine insisted. "I was denied my assigned first-class seat without explanation after being publicly humiliated at the boarding gate." Michael stepped forward, his posture defensive. "Ma'am, we've already explained that there was a technical issue with your seating assignment." "A technical issue that somehow only affected me," Jasmine observed. "The only black passenger with a first-class ticket." "Here we go again with the race accusations," Diana muttered, loud enough for Jasmine to hear. "If you'll excuse us," Brittany said dismissively, "we have another flight to prepare for." It was the final straw. Jasmine reached into her bag and removed her federal credentials, holding them up for all three airline employees to see. Jasmine Powell, Federal Aviation Administration, lead investigator for civil rights compliance, she announced, her voice clear and authoritative. "I've been conducting an undercover audit of your airline's compliance with federal anti-discrimination regulations, and I've documented numerous violations during today's flight." The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Brittany's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing without producing words. Michael froze in place, his eyes fixed on Jasmine's federal ID. Diana took an involuntary step backward, bumping into a passenger walking past. We didn't." Brittany stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating. "You didn't know who I was," Jasmine finished for her. "That was the point. But the more relevant question is, would it have mattered? Should any passenger, regardless of their position or authority, be subjected to the treatment I received today?" Michael recovered first, his customer service training kicking in despite the shock. "Ms. Powell, we sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding." "This wasn't a misunderstanding," Jasmine interrupted. "It was discriminatory treatment, documented in detail, witnessed by dozens of passengers, and recorded for federal review." She held up the pen camera that had been clipped to her blouse throughout the journey. "Every interaction at the gate, every conversation about these people, every disparate service decision has been captured for our investigation." By now, a small crowd had gathered. Passengers from the flight recognized Jasmine from the boarding incident and stopped to watch. Airport staff slowed their work, sensing something significant unfolding. "I'll need to speak with your regional manager immediately," Jasmine continued. "And I'll require access to a private room for initial interviews with all staff involved in today's incidents." As if summoned by the gravity of the situation, a harried-looking woman in a crisp suit hurried toward them. Her name tag identified her as Patricia Reynolds, Regional Customer Service Manager. "What's happening here?" Patricia asked, looking between the ashen-faced airline employees and Jasmine's authoritative stance. "Ms. Reynolds," Michael began, his voice unsteady, "this is Jasmine Powell from the FAA. She was conducting an audit on today's flight." Patricia's professional demeanor couldn't entirely mask her alarm. "An audit? We weren't notified of any scheduled audit." "That's the nature of compliance testing," Jasmine explained calmly. "Undercover audits provide an accurate picture of how passengers are actually treated, rather than how they're treated when staff know they're being evaluated." She proceeded to outline the incidents that had occurred, from the discriminatory scrutiny at boarding to the seat reassignment and the pattern of biased service throughout the flight. With each detail, Patricia's expression grew more concerned. Ms. Powell, I want to assure you that what you've described does not reflect our company's values or policies, Patricia insisted. We take these allegations extremely seriously. They aren't allegations, Jasmine corrected. They're documented violations of federal transportation anti-discrimination laws. And they appear to be systematic rather than isolated. By now, Brittany had moved behind Michael, as if seeking protection from the consequences unfolding before her. Diana stared at the floor, while Michael attempted to maintain a professional facade despite his obvious distress. We should continue this conversation somewhere private, Patricia suggested, gesturing toward the airline's executive lounge. I'll need to interview each staff member individually, Jasmine replied. Starting with Ms. Stevens, Mr. Thompson, and Ms. Carter. She indicated Brittany, Michael, and Diana in turn, noting their surprise that she knew all their names. Of course, Patricia agreed quickly. We'll cooperate fully with your investigation. As they moved toward the lounge, Jasmine noticed several passengers from the flight watching the scene with satisfaction. Walter, who had spoken up for her at the gate, gave her a subtle nod of approval. Sarah, the teenager working on her social studies project, was recording discreetly on her phone. Elaine, the elderly woman who had sat beside her, smiled with vindication in her eyes. Inside the executive lounge, a space Jasmine had been effectively deemed unworthy to enter hours earlier, Patricia scrambled to provide accommodations. Can I offer you something to drink? Coffee? Water? Patricia asked, her customer service training kicking into overdrive. Water is fine, Jasmine replied, taking a seat at the conference table and removing her official documentation materials from her bag. I'll need the complete passenger manifest from today's flight, copies of all relevant company policies regarding seating assignments and customer service protocols, and personnel files for all staff involved in today's incidents. Patricia hesitated. Some of that information may require approval from corporate, Ms. Reynolds, Jasmine interrupted, let me be clear. This is now an official federal investigation into civil rights violations. Failure to provide requested documentation will be noted in my report as non-compliance, which carries its own penalties. I'd suggest you contact your legal department immediately. The gravity of the situation finally seemed to register fully with Patricia. She nodded and stepped away to make a phone call, her hushed, urgent tone audible even from across the room. Jasmine began setting up her documentation, arranging her notes and preparing to download the recordings from her devices. As she worked, Brittany was brought in for the first interview, her earlier confidence replaced by visible anxiety. Please state your full name and position for the record, Jasmine began once the recording equipment was properly set up. Brittany Marie Stevens, flight attendant, 7 years with the airline, Brittany replied, her voice small. Ms. Stevens, can you explain why you questioned the validity of my first-class ticket when white passengers before and after me were processed without similar scrutiny? Brittany shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't about race. We've had issues with fraudulent upgrades recently, and I was just being thorough. And can you provide documentation of these fraudulent upgrade incidents? Records showing this is a widespread problem requiring special scrutiny. I don't have those records personally, Brittany admitted. That would be something management tracks. I see, Jasmine made a note. And when you discussed, these people always trying to use points for upgrades with your colleague Kevin Richards, who exactly were you referring to? Brittany's eyes widened. You heard that? I documented it, Jasmine corrected. Along with numerous other comments about these people and discussions about passengers playing the race card. The realization that everything had been recorded seemed to deflate Brittany entirely. I didn't mean, we weren't. Your actions and words speak for themselves, Ms. Stevens, Jasmine said evenly. The question now is whether they represent your personal biases or reflect a broader culture within this airline. The interviews continued with Michael and Diana, each following a similar pattern. Initial denials gave way to uncomfortable admissions when confronted with specific documented incidents. The evidence was irrefutable, and with each interview, the picture of systemic discrimination became clearer. By late afternoon, word had spread through the airport about the federal investigation. Other airline employees watched nervously as Jasmine conducted her work. Passengers who had witnessed the original confrontation stopped by to offer their accounts or express support. Throughout it all, Jasmine maintained her professional demeanor, methodically building a case that would be impossible to dismiss as an isolated incident or misunderstanding. As evening approached, Jasmine received a call from the airline's corporate headquarters. The CEO, Richard Harrison, requested an emergency video conference. Patricia set up the call in the executive lounge, clearly hoping the CEO's involvement might somehow mitigate the situation. When Richard's face appeared on the screen, his expression was a careful mix of concern and contrition. "Ms. Powell, I want to personally apologize for your experience today," he began. "What you've described is completely unacceptable and contradicts everything our airline claims to stand for." "I appreciate that, Mr. Harrison," Jasmine replied evenly. "But I'm more interested in systemic solutions than personal apologies. The patterns I observed today suggest these aren't isolated incidents but symptoms of a broader problem within your corporate culture." Richard nodded gravely. "I understand. We want to work with the FAA to address any issues comprehensively. What can we do to make this right?" "Making it right isn't about appeasing me or the FAA," Jasmine explained. "It's about ensuring every passenger receives equal treatment regardless of their race or appearance. My full report will include specific recommendations for policy changes, training programs, and compliance monitoring. We'll implement whatever changes are necessary," Richard promised. "Including terminating staff who engaged in discriminatory behavior?" Jasmine asked pointedly. Richard hesitated only briefly. "Yes, including personnel changes where appropriate." Jasmine nodded, satisfied with his commitment if not entirely convinced of its sincerity. "My report will be filed within 72 hours. I expect a formal response from your airline within 10 business days." As the call ended, Jasmine gathered her materials and prepared to leave. The day had been exhausting, emotionally and physically, but productive beyond her expectations. The evidence she had gathered would be difficult for even the most skeptical reviewer to dismiss. Patricia approached as Jasmine packed up. "Ms. Powell, we've arranged a car to take you to your hotel, and we'd like to offer you a complimentary suite upgrade and dining credit as a small gesture." "That won't be necessary," Jasmine interrupted. "I'm not interested in preferential treatment now any more than I was this morning. What I want is equal treatment for all passengers, regardless of race." As Jasmine left the executive lounge, she passed Brittany, Michael, and Diana sitting silently in a corner, their faces reflecting the dawning realization that their actions would have consequences. The power dynamic had shifted completely, but Jasmine took no pleasure in their discomfort. This wasn't about retribution, it was about accountability and systemic change. Outside the airport, as Jasmine waited for her actual hotel transportation, she reflected on the day's events. The humiliation she had endured was painful, but it had served a greater purpose. Her experience would now become evidence, her personal indignity transformed into professional purpose. The airline had indeed had no idea who they were dealing with, not just because of her position, but because of her determination to ensure justice for those who didn't have federal badges to protect them. The following morning, Jasmine woke to her phone buzzing with notifications. News of the undercover federal audit had spread like wildfire through the airline industry overnight. Her personal email contained messages from airline executives, civil rights organizations, and even a few journalists seeking comment. She ignored them all for the moment, focusing instead on compiling her official report. Seated at the desk in her hotel room, Jasmine downloaded the recordings from her devices and began the meticulous process of documenting every violation observed during her journey. The evidence was overwhelming. From the initial boarding confrontation to the disparate service on the flight, the pattern of discrimination was impossible to deny. The recorded conversations between staff members provided damning context, revealing attitudes that normalized and justified discriminatory treatment. Midway through her work, Jasmine received a call from Director Wilson at FAA headquarters. "Powell, the airline's legal team has been blowing up our phones since dawn," he said without preamble. "What exactly happened yesterday?" Jasmine provided a concise summary of the events, from being denied her first-class seat to the revelations at Atlanta's airport. Wilson let out a low whistle. "Sounds like you hit the jackpot as far as evidence goes. Any chance they could claim this was an isolated incident?" "None whatsoever," Jasmine replied confidently. "I documented at least 17 distinct violations involving multiple staff members. And I have statements from other passengers who experienced or witnessed similar treatment." "Good work," Wilson said. "The airline's CEO is requesting a meeting with department heads this afternoon. How soon can you have preliminary findings ready to share?" "I can have a summary prepared within 3 hours," Jasmine promised. "The full report will take another day or two to complete properly." After ending the call, Jasmine returned to her documentation with renewed focus. This wasn't just about one airline or one incident anymore. The attention this case was receiving could potentially impact policies across the entire industry. Around noon, Jasmine's hotel room phone rang. The front desk informed her that several airline executives were in the lobby requesting to meet with her. "I didn't schedule any meetings at the hotel," Jasmine replied, immediately suspicious. "They're quite insistent, Ms. Powell," the desk clerk explained. "They say it's regarding yesterday's incident." Jasmine considered for a moment. "Please inform them that all communications should go through official FAA channels. I'm not available for impromptu meetings." This was a typical damage control tactic, trying to resolve issues informally, off the record, before they became official findings. Jasmine had seen it before and knew better than to engage. Less than an hour later, her personal cell phone rang with an unfamiliar local number. "Ms. Powell? This is Brittany Stevens." Jasmine was momentarily taken aback. How had the flight attendant obtained her personal number? "Ms. Stevens, I'm in the middle of preparing my official report," Jasmine said professionally. "Any statements you wish to make should be directed to the formal investigation." "Please," Brittany's voice cracked slightly. "Just give me 2 minutes. I need you to understand, I'm not a racist. What happened yesterday wasn't about race. We have protocols for suspected fraud." "Ms. Stevens," Jasmine interrupted firmly, "your actions and statements were thoroughly documented. If you have an explanation for why you treated me differently than white passengers with identical tickets, or why you repeatedly referred to black passengers as these people, or why you enforced policies selectively based on passengers' race, those explanations should be provided through proper channels." "They're going to fire me," Brittany said, her voice small. 15 years in this industry, and my career is over because of one misunderstanding." Jasmine felt a momentary pang of sympathy, quickly replaced by resolve. "What happened wasn't a misunderstanding, Ms. Stevens. It was discrimination, witnessed by dozens of passengers and documented in detail. And based on the conversations I overheard, it wasn't an isolated incident but part of a pattern of behavior." After ending the call, Jasmine requested that the hotel block any further calls from unknown numbers. She needed to focus on her report without emotional appeals or attempted negotiations. By mid-afternoon, airline management was in full crisis mode. Through her FAA contacts, Jasmine learned that an emergency board meeting had been called. The company's stock had already dropped 3% as rumors of a federal discrimination investigation circulated among investors. Jasmine's preliminary findings were delivered to Director Wilson as promised. Within hours, they were being discussed in a meeting between FAA officials and the airline's senior leadership. Meanwhile, social media was buzzing with accounts of the incident. Several passengers had posted about witnessing the confrontation at the Detroit gate. Sarah, the teenager working on her social studies project, had shared her recordings with her teacher, who in turn shared them with local civil rights organizations. Walter Johnson, the passenger who had spoken up for Jasmine at the gate, gave an interview to a local Atlanta news station. "I've been flying for 40 years, he told the reporter, and I've seen this kind of thing happen too many times to count. The difference this time is that the woman they picked on had the power to do something about it." By evening, Jasmine's hotel room had become an impromptu office. 2 additional FAA investigators had been dispatched to Atlanta to assist with the expanding investigation. Passenger statements were being collected, airline policies examined, and staff interviews conducted. Patricia Reynolds, the regional manager who had initially tried to downplay the situation, arrived with 3 thick binders of company policies and training materials. Ms. Powell, Patricia began cautiously, "I want you to know that I've initiated an internal review of all our service protocols. What happened to you doesn't reflect our written policies. The gap between written policies and actual practices is precisely what concerns me," Jasmine replied. "A non-discrimination policy is meaningless if staff aren't trained properly or held accountable for violations." Patricia nodded uncomfortably. "We're prepared to implement whatever changes the FAA recommends. The CEO has authorized me to offer accommodations for any inconvenience." Ms. Reynolds, Jasmine interrupted, "I appreciate that you're trying to make amends, but special treatment for me doesn't address the systemic issues. What about the passengers who don't have federal badges? Who speaks for them when they're humiliated or discriminated against?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Patricia left the materials and departed with promises of full cooperation. As the investigation expanded, more airline employees came forward with information. James, the flight attendant who had shown Jasmine kindness during the flight, provided a written statement describing a culture of bias that had worsened over the past few years. "It's never explicit in our training," his statement read. "But there's an unspoken understanding about which passengers deserve extra scrutiny and which ones get the benefit of the doubt. I've tried to treat everyone equally, but I've been reprimanded for being too accommodating to certain passengers." Other staff members, speaking anonymously, confirmed James's assessment. They described an environment where discriminatory behavior was tacitly encouraged through a wink-and-nod system of rewards and punishments. By the following morning, news of the investigation had reached national media. Jasmine's phone was inundated with interview requests, which she declined. This wasn't about personal attention or vindication, it was about systemic change. Around noon, Jasmine received a call from CEO Richard Harrison. "Ms. Powell, I've reviewed your preliminary findings," he began, his tone grave. "I want to personally assure you that we're taking this matter with the utmost seriousness. Effective immediately, we've placed the staff members involved on administrative leave pending the conclusion of the investigation." "That's a start," Jasmine acknowledged. "But addressing individual behavior without examining the underlying culture won't prevent future incidents." "I agree completely," Harrison replied, perhaps too quickly. "We're implementing a comprehensive review of all customer service protocols and training programs. We've also engaged a respected civil rights organization to help us develop new anti-bias training for all customer-facing staff." Jasmine recognized the public relations strategy: swift action, contrition, promises of reform. It was textbook crisis management. Whether it reflected genuine commitment to change remained to be seen. "Mr. Harrison," she said carefully, "my report will include specific recommendations for policy changes, training programs, and compliance monitoring. I'll be particularly interested to see how your company responds to those recommendations." "You have my word that we'll implement them fully," Harrison promised. "This incident has been a wake-up call for our entire organization." After the call, Jasmine met with her FAA colleagues to discuss next steps. The investigation had expanded beyond the original audit parameters, now encompassing systematic practices across multiple airports and flights. "This could be industry-changing," remarked one of the other investigators. "If we establish clear precedent with this airline, others will take notice." Jasmine nodded. "That's the goal. Not just addressing this incident, but creating standards that protect all passengers from discriminatory treatment. As she walked through the Atlanta airport that evening, heading to her return flight to Detroit, Jasmine noticed how airline staff watched her pass. Word had spread about who she was and what her investigation had uncovered. Some looked away uncomfortably. Others nodded with something like respect or even gratitude. At the gate for her return flight, Jasmine presented her boarding pass, first class again, as originally booked by the FAA. The gate agent's hands trembled slightly as she processed it. "Thank you, Ms. Powell," the agent said, making deliberate eye contact. "We appreciate your business." The contrast with her treatment 2 days earlier couldn't have been more stark. But Jasmine took no satisfaction in the special treatment now being offered out of fear rather than respect. True equality meant being treated with dignity not because of who you are or what power you hold, but simply because you're a human being deserving of respect. As she settled into her first-class seat for the return journey, Jasmine reflected on how a routine audit had transformed into something much more significant. What had begun as a professional assignment had become personal, then expanded into a potential catalyst for industry-wide change. The airline had indeed had no idea who they were dealing with. Not just because of her federal authority, but because of her unwavering commitment to justice and her refusal to accept discrimination as inevitable. In attempting to put Jasmine in her place, they had instead given her the perfect platform to advocate for all those who had ever been made to feel they didn't belong. 6 months later, Jasmine Powell stood before a congressional subcommittee on transportation equity, her testimony the culmination of what had become known in the industry as the Atlanta audit. The packed hearing room fell silent as she began to speak. Distinguished committee members, what began as a standard compliance check revealed a culture of systematic discrimination that affects thousands of passengers daily, Jasmine stated, her voice steady and authoritative. The incident I experienced personally was not an anomaly but rather a window into widespread practices that violate both federal law and basic human dignity. Seated behind her were representatives from civil rights organizations, aviation industry groups, and several passengers who had come forward with their own experiences after her story became public. Among them sat Elaine, Walter, and Sarah, witnesses to the original incident who had become advocates in their own right. On the other side of the room, airline executives listened intently. Notably absent were Brittany Stevens, Michael Thompson, and Diana Carter. All three had been terminated following the investigation. CEO Richard Harrison sat front and center, his expression appropriately solemn. The comprehensive audit of this airline led to the identification of 173 distinct civil rights violations across 47 flights, Jasmine continued. These violations followed clear patterns. Black passengers were 3 times more likely to have their tickets or upgrades questioned, 5 times more likely to be accused of disruptive behavior, and received measurably different service quality even when seated in the same cabin class. The statistics painted a damning picture, one that couldn't be dismissed as subjective perception or isolated incidents. This was systematic discrimination, documented with federal rigor. As a result of our findings, the Federal Aviation Administration has implemented new compliance requirements for all commercial airlines operating in the United States, Jasmine explained. These requirements include mandatory anti-bias training, anonymous testing procedures similar to the audit I conducted, and substantial penalties for companies that fail to address discriminatory practices. The airline at the center of the investigation had faced both public relations disaster and financial consequences. A 7-figure settlement had been reached with the Department of Justice, and class action lawsuits from affected passengers were still pending. More significantly, the company had been forced to implement comprehensive reforms under federal supervision. The airline in question has taken significant steps to address these issues, Jasmine acknowledged. They've revised their training programs with input from civil rights experts, implemented blind auditing of customer interactions, and established clear accountability measures for staff at all levels. Richard Harrison nodded gravely from his seat. The reforms hadn't been voluntary, they were mandated by the settlement, but the company had embraced them publicly as part of their rehabilitation strategy. However, Jasmine continued, policy changes alone are insufficient. True transformation requires cultural change, consistent enforcement, and ongoing vigilance. After the hearing, Jasmine met briefly with several of the passengers who had been on that fateful flight. Walter Johnson, now actively involved with a transportation equity nonprofit, shook her hand warmly. "You've changed things," he told her. "Not just for that airline, but for all of us who've been treated like we don't belong." Sarah, now a college freshman studying social justice, had expanded her high school project into a documentary about transportation discrimination. "Your story was the catalyst," she explained excitedly. "It got people talking about experiences they'd previously just accepted as normal." Elaine, the elderly woman who had sat beside Jasmine on the flight, held her hands and spoke softly. "I've been flying for 60 years, child. I've seen the signs come down, the laws change, but the attitudes remained. What you did matters. It really matters." 2 weeks after the congressional testimony, Jasmine received news of her promotion. The FAA had created a new division focused specifically on equity in transportation, and she had been appointed as its director. The position came with expanded authority, additional resources, and the opportunity to implement the lessons learned from the Atlanta audit on a national scale. On her first day in the new role, Jasmine received an unexpected visitor. James, the flight attendant who had shown her kindness during the discriminatory incident, had left the airline and applied for a position with the FAA. "After everything that happened, I couldn't stay," he explained. "But I realized I could do more good working on these issues from the inside, just like you." Jasmine hired him as a training specialist, recognizing the value of his industry experience and genuine commitment to change. The ripple effects continued to spread. Other transportation sectors, railways, bus lines, cruise ships, began proactively reviewing their own practices to avoid similar scrutiny. Civil rights organizations reported an increase in passengers coming forward with their experiences, emboldened by Jasmine's example. Statistics told the most compelling story. In the year following the Atlanta audit, discrimination complaints against major airlines decreased by 38%. Independent testing showed measurable improvements in service consistency across passenger demographics. The industry was far from perfect, but meaningful progress was being made. 3 months into her new role, Jasmine found herself boarding another flight. This time, it wasn't an undercover assignment but an official trip to a transportation equity conference. As she approached the gate, she noticed how differently she was treated compared to a year ago. The respect she received wasn't because of her federal badge, which remained tucked away in her bag, but because airline staff had been properly trained to treat all passengers with equal dignity. Taking her seat in first class, a legitimate upgrade based on her frequent flyer status, Jasmine reflected on how one moment of standing firm had created ripples of change throughout an industry. The humiliation she had endured had been transformed into a catalyst for progress that benefited thousands. As the plane taxied for takeoff, Jasmine thought about all the passengers who would never know her name but whose travel experiences would be better because she had refused to accept discrimination as inevitable. That was the true victory, not personal vindication, but systemic change that lifted everyone. Has this story resonated with your own experiences or observations? Comment below and share your thoughts on transportation discrimination or times when you've witnessed someone standing up for what's right. If you believe everyone deserves equal treatment regardless of their appearance, hit that like button and subscribe to see more stories of justice and accountability. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that discrimination still happens, and that we all have the power to make a difference. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to accept injustice as normal. This powerful story reveals the insidious nature of everyday discrimination that continues to affect countless individuals. Jasmine's experience highlights how racism often operates behind a veneer of policies and protocols that are selectively enforced against people of color. What makes this story particularly significant is that it demonstrates how institutional power can be wielded both for discrimination and for accountability. The lesson here goes beyond exposing injustice, it shows the importance of documentation, persistence, and strategic action. Jasmine could have revealed her identity immediately to avoid personal humiliation, but by enduring the mistreatment, she gathered comprehensive evidence that created systemic change benefiting thousands of future travelers. This narrative also underscores the value of allyship. From Walter's public intervention to Sarah's documentation and Elaine's quiet solidarity, we see how witnesses to discrimination can play vital roles in supporting those directly affected. Perhaps most importantly, this story challenges the notion that discrimination only happens in obvious, blatant forms. Modern racism often manifests in subtle differentials in treatment, questioning the legitimacy of some passengers while others sail through, providing different levels of service, or applying standard protocols unequally based on appearance. By standing firm and refusing to accept discrimination as inevitable, one person with conviction can ignite transformation that extends far beyond their individual experience. Has this story of courage and accountability made you reflect on times when you've witnessed or experienced discrimination in public spaces? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to stand up against unfair treatment, or wish you had? Let us know by typing "justice" in the comments. If you believe everyone deserves equal treatment regardless of their race or appearance, hit that like button to support more stories that shine light on these important issues. Subscribe to our channel for weekly stories of resilience and justice that aren't covered in mainstream media. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that discrimination isn't just historical, it happens every day, in seemingly professional environments, to real people. Your share might open someone's eyes to realities they've been privileged enough to never experience. Thank you for watching and being part of a community that values truth, justice, and human dignity. Remember, change happens one conversation, one stand, and one person at a time.